All right, to begin with, a little bit of business. I like to start off class this way because honestly, I forget otherwise. First of all, you guys are actually doing better than my other classes, but we still don't have everyone. So I believe the number when I checked Sunday morning, I think we have 16 people signed up for turnitin.com, and that's out of like 22 or however many we have in the class total. So it's pretty good. However, that means there's about 6 or so of you who have not signed up for turnitin.com, and as I tried to stress last week, that's how you turn in your papers. So you got to do that. Like, I mean, on the small scale of importance, that's how you turn in our most recent homework assignment. That's how you're going to do the peer review that I'm about to talk to you about. That's how you're going to do certain things throughout the semester, right? So you should sign up. But if you do no homework, which would be a mistake, you got to turn in your papers, man. Like, that's the thing that has to happen. So if you have not done so, please sign up for turnitin.com today at some point. Like I said, there's an email I sent to you with the info. You should be able to find it rather easily. You got to get that taken care of. On that note, as I said, peer review. Unlike most of your homework, this is due on the 2nd, which I think is Wednesday. Little thing about how Turnitin works. If you have not turned in the thesis body paragraph assignment that we did, that was due Saturday, you will not be able to do the peer review, okay? That's just a thing about how Turnitin works. So sign up for Turnitin if you haven't. Maybe turn in that homework if you haven't. Because if you don't do those two things, you will not be able to do Wednesday's homework. Also, we have a rough draft due Saturday, like usual. That's also on Turnitin. A lot of Turnitin stuff coming at you here in the next week or so, so maybe sign up. All right, so here's what we're going to do. What I like to do with beauty, I guess I should talk to you about why I like to teach it, first of all. Number one, I like to have it be the last poem we read. This is the last poem we're going to read for this unit, in case you were unaware. I have 2 big reasons I like to end with it. Number one, it's the longest thing we're going to read up to this point. And actually what we're going to do today is a lot of sort of mapping, you could call it. By the end of this class, we're going to have a bunch of stuff up on the board that helps us kind of stand back from this longer poem and say, oh, okay, here's like the big thematic concerns. Here's some big ideas in this poem that maybe I might have missed if I hadn't have mapped them out in this way, right? That's one thing we're going to do. And I like to do that with a longer work because that's also what we're going to do in Unit 2 when we read a novel, which is considerably longer than a poem. But the second reason I like to do it is actually probably the reason he starts his book with that poem. It's the very first poem in this book. Is everything we've talked about thus far, Body and Soul, Old Men Playing Basketball, any of the poems we've read, okay? The different ideas we've brought up, the concerns, they're pretty much all reflected in some way, shape, or form in beauty, right? So if you leave today and you're like, I'm not writing about that fucking poem, that's fine, but I promise you, some of the ideas we bring up today will absolutely tie into the other poems that you might potentially write about, so it's still worth your time. All right, group 1. If you could start us off with a summary of your part. Just like where do we start? Do you guys want to look at each other and decide who's going to do this?
We start with, I'd say, a couple in Florence.
Good. Florence where?
Italy.
Good. Not everybody knows that. We're in Italy. Does anybody speak Italian a little bit? No. I've never looked up how to pronounce Bargello, I assume? I don't know. But they're at a museum in Italy, which is a terribly fancy place to be. Right? Okay. What happens after that? We leave Italy behind pretty quickly, right? Where do we go? Kansas. How do we get there? Plane?
Reflecting on the name of beauty.
Well, she asks, the speaker's partner asks what he's thinking about, and he says, beauty, and then he goes back and he's thinking about Kansas, right? So we're going, in a similar way to many of the poems we've read thus far, we're going into a memory now of Kansas. Okay? And we hear a lot about Kansas, and a lot of this probably sounds pretty reminiscent, again, of the other stuff we've looked at thus far, right? Because it's all about Kansas or Oklahoma or Texas, right? It's all kind of that same general populace, I suppose. Okay? What else happens? Talk a lot about beauty, right? What are some of the things we say about beauty?
He remembers how none of the male members in his family use the word beauty.
Except maybe in reference to a new pickup or dead deer, he says at one point, which is interesting. Yeah, okay. And beauty comes up again. They're watching TV. What happens with the TV and beauty? These two authors doing something. What are they doing? These two authors are talking about something together on TV.
They were discussing beauty.
There you go. Yeah. I thought that was a softball. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, they're talking about beauty, which strikes the speaker in a certain kind of way. Maybe we'll talk about it. And then we move to Uncle Ross. What happens with Uncle Ross?
He calls the centerpiece lovely, and then it disturbs the speaker's father.
So much so that
He left the room.
he leaves the room, which is an interesting response. Okay, pretty good. Now then, alarm bells, things you noticed in part one that kind of stood out to you. What we got? So you guys are writing a whole bunch, so I mean, I figure I got something.
When he says that his dad was troubled by the word lovely, and then he said, with the very idea of California,
Okay.
that the uncle likes to tap dance.
We learned some weird stuff about the uncle, right? All right. So to begin with, we learn, like, pretty early on in the poem that you can't say beauty, right? Specifically, who can't say it?
Men?
Men, right? That seems pretty clear at a certain point, okay? Yeah. And along with beauty and the not saying it, there seems to be other ideas, other elements that you also can't associate with, right? And Uncle Ross seems to be on that other side, right? Weird details we point out about Uncle Ross. He's from California, which is going to come up again later, right? He likes to tap dance. Apparently that's a problem. And he says about the centerpiece that it's lovely, which is a nice compliment. But it also is a bit of a synonym, right? So much so that the father has to leave the room. If someone, like if I came in, and I would not, but if I came in and said a word that you felt strongly enough about to leave the room, why would you do that? Like, how would you describe how you felt about that word? That word is what to you? Offensive. Yeah. Now again, in the silence of your own selves, we're not saying these out loud, think about what word or words those might be. Okay. Now lump in with that beautiful, lovely. For the Father, that's how he reacts here, okay? So he has a strong opinion about that word and potentially about whatever else is associated with it, right? So it seems to matter a great deal. We also say, along those same lines, it's not just California, right? The speaker tells us it's the idea of California. Just like we talked about at one point when we were talking about Little Boy, I believe it was. We said that poem is thinking about the idea of America. Not America necessarily like we're right here, right? But what it represents. So California in this poem, to the speaker's father, for instance, seems to represent something, right? And again, it seems to, in this section at least, be on this side, right? Along with like saying beauty or lovely, right? Tap dancing, I guess, whatever that is. California, the idea of it, to the speaker's father, means something. Good. What else you guys notice? There's a biggie. I would be struck if you guys didn't notice this as like, again, just strange. You don't have to have a reading of it, but like this should stand out, man. This is odd. Talk to me about the two authors discussing beauty. What does our speaker have to say about it?
How kind of common topic food was.
How what?
How like easily they talk about it.
Yeah, and that strikes him as strange, right? Because men don't do that. They should be talking about, he says, Oklahoma football or some guy's hemorrhoid operation. Okay? But they were discussing beauty and tossing around allusions to Plato and Aristotle and someone named Pater. These are philosophers, thinkers. What else did he say about them talking about beauty? He says a pretty interesting thing.
Because it's not like a masculine thing for him.
That they might be homosexuals, he says. And then he doubles down. He says, that would be a natural conclusion, of course, since here were two grown men talking about beauty instead of scratching their crotches and cursing the goddamn government trying to run everybody's business. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of a weird thing. Here's two guys talking about beauty. They must be gay. Apparently, right? Seems strange. Well, for these characters, seems to sort of go on that side of the fence too, right? So now questions of sexuality are in play as well in this poem, right? And we've definitely talked about that this semester. Anything else stand out to you guys in this first part? Just as odd or interesting? Something we should notice?
Whenever he thought of something as like beautiful or attractive, he wouldn't say it because it was kind of taboo.
What are you thinking of, just so we know where you're at?
The light from the Venetian wines, the autumn silver Kansas light laying on the table that Sunday.
I would not have said so then. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Yeah. So he's remembering these little moments back then, but he also acknowledges that he would not have noticed or said how beautiful they were then, right? So the speaker's also telling us that, you know, he was on this side growing up, right? We're going to try to fill this in, by the way, but he was over here. Guess we can start to, because we've already said, right? You're not allowed to say that. Okay. Last thing I'll bring up, right at the end of the section, we get a good definition about what beauty is for these people and like why they can't say it. He's thinking about these people working, right, in this machine shop that we're going to get to know here in part 2. Men who knew the true meaning of labor and money and other hard, true things, and did not ever use the word beauty. In that one line, you don't get what beauty is, at least explicitly, but you get what it's not, right, to these guys. Which is to say, again, because this seems to be our setup, hard, true, this question of labor, right, seems to go over here for these people, whatever that is. Because it's not beauty to these people. All right. Part 2, you can give us a summary. What happens? We meet an interesting character in part 2. What's his name? Wait, who had part 2? Yeah, you guys, right?
I did.
Yeah,
I read part 3.
you guys definitely.
I did part 2. No, me and you got part 2. She was I did 2 and 4.
Okay, why? They had part 2, you had part 3, you had part 4. But, okay.
I kind of started reading part 2 because I kind of figured that I read the wrong one.
Okay. This is an interesting predicament. So who did part 2? Just to help me out? Okay. Well, then I'll look at you guys, but feel free to jump in. Who do we meet? Bobby. Bobby Suddeth. What do we learn about Bobby? We learn a couple interesting things about this guy.
He's bold.
Why do you say that?
Like, he said something about him having sex with his sister.
He claims to have had sex with his sister, which among other things I guess you could describe as bold. Sure. He says something else too along the similar lines. What else does he say? Here, I'll take us to that spot in the poem. That's right, this is Bobby speaking. Fucked my own sister, and I'll tell you, bud, it wasn't bad. Later in the Philippines, what does he say?
As far as I'm concerned,
Any man who hasn't had VD just isn't a man. What's VD? This is an old term. But you must have looked it up, right? Venereal disease. He's talking about STDs. So according to Bobby, 2 important pieces of information we learn about him. He slept with his sister, said it wasn't bad. Okay. And you're not a man if you haven't had an STD, according to Bobby. Okay. That's how we start part 2. What else happens? We leave Bobby, perhaps thankfully. What happens after that?
Kennedy was shot.
Kennedy's assassinated. And everything in that moment kind of stops, right? Okay. And then we have another stanza where we talk about the sort of television coverage. These guys just kind of living through that. They talk about dreaming it, right? It's just kind of everywhere. And then we come back to Bobby at the end of this section. What does Bobby say?
Oswald, not you got to admit that shot was a beauty.
He says it. He says beauty, which is interesting. You're not supposed to be able to do that. Okay. So let's walk through this. First of all, we have to talk about Bobby's sexual autobiography. It's kind of hard not to. I like to make the distinction, to begin with, that he claims to have slept with his sister, okay? We cannot confirm, nor should we, I think, that he actually did that, okay? And I would argue that that's not what's important, right? What matters is this guy claims to have done it, right? Plenty of people do all kinds of wacky stuff, but they tend to keep that to themselves. Bobby's like, nope, totally did it. right here. VD, yep, me too. Let's go. I just realized I'm putting this on the internet. Yeah. Anyway. What do we know about Bobby? What would motivate a person to say those things, do you think? Like, why is he claiming to have slept with his sister and to have an STD? Openly. Seems like he would tell anybody. Why do that? Well, but in a certain kind of way, right? Like, what I'm saying is he's kind of making the argument to the speaker, hey, these are a couple things you should know about me so that you know one very important thing about me. What's driving Bobby to claim these things to the speaker?
To be more masculine.
But how so? What's so masculine in Bobby's mind about these things? I mean, just what he says, you're not a man if you haven't had VD, according to Bobby. What? What is he trying to argue? Being a man to Bobby is what? Okay. We'll slow it down. This is not health class, but it will feel like it for a minute. Typically, how do you get an STD? Good, it's in the name. Okay. So Bobby, claiming he has an STD, is also claiming good. Now, I think we would all agree, he takes it a step further and says, quote, fucked my own sister. Those two things taken together, I have an STD and yeah, I sleep with my siblings. He's kind of telling the speaker, like, what is important to Bobby?
Like sexualizing women.
Would you just sex? He has all the sex. I have so much sex. I have VD. I slept with my sister. I'll bang anything. It doesn't matter, right? Like, that's what Bobby is saying, right? That's what he's arguing to the speaker. And again, Bobby says, you're not a man if you're not kind of in that same, like on that same wavelength, right? Okay. That seems to be over here. Now, I'm going to do one thing. I think we would all agree in some ways, Bobby is on this side. That much is clear. But he also seems to be kind of his own guy. Right? He might take it a little further than most. So I kind of, like, I think sex is a part of this, but in Bobby's way in particular, I think it's also, you give him his own section a little bit. Okay. Well, now that's interesting. Let's talk about JFK for a minute. Seems to really affect these people, right? Everything stops. We have a stanza break, and then all of that next stanza, we're talking about the coverage, right? And just how these people are affected. I feel like at this stage it's important to kind of underscore, I guess, national tragedy for you guys. I don't know if you've had one yet. I mean, you may have. You're old enough to. Do you guys have one? I know it's a damn weird question. But, like, I'll put it to you this way. I was in high school when 9/11 happened, so I remember it. Like, I was a sophomore. I was in biology class. I can remember it. We stayed in that classroom all day, which is, like, not what you do in high school, right? We just watched it on the shitty TV. And then at some point, I think we went home kind of early. I also remember Columbine, right? I remember getting sent home for that. I remember watching that on TV too. Like, I remember those days. They're very crystalline for me, right? And what's interesting about those, apart from the tragedy of it, right, is like when JFK happened, it became the question, where were you when JFK was shot? Like, people who were alive at the time remember it that way. They remember where they were, and it's something like that we as a culture can like share, right? We all remember it somehow. You guys probably weren't even alive for 9/11, right? Like, it was 2001, If anything, you were very, very small. But one thing it seems to be getting at in the last part of part 2 is that national tragedy, this sort of, again, uniting aspect they seem to have in a way. But then when you read the end of part 2, again, it's like, well, what is uniting these guys when they talk about that tragedy? It seems to be like a lot of confusion and just like uncertainty, I guess, like not understanding the world around them somehow, right? Seems to be the big takeaway from the end of part 2. And then to sum all that up, we get Bobby. And he says, Oswald, from that far away, that shot was a beauty. Why does he get to say it there, do you think? What's he talking about, first of all? Who's Oswald? The assassin. Yeah. So we're saying that shot was a beauty. What does he mean?
A shot from like that distance.
It was a hell of a shot. It was a really good shot. Okay. So why does he get to say the word then, do you think? In a different context, right? Good. So we've also said that you can say it, I'm putting quotation marks, because it's different in some kind of important way, right? Another thing the poem wants us to think about maybe, we have beauty over here, like a centerpiece can be lovely, right? And these other ways that we're going to talk about beauty throughout the poem, maybe in ways that we're more used to when we think of beauty. Then there's another kind that you can say over here, and it's a pickup or a dead deer, or it's a hell of a shot when you take a guy's head off, right? Very different. Okay. Part 3. I don't know who had it now. You, and then you, somehow? Okay. Your partners you didn't even know. What happens in part 3? You summarize it for us.
Okay, so in part 3, the speaker's talking about back when like they were a kid.
Yeah.
And so like their dad had a shop.
He runs the machine shop.
Yeah. And so like he ran the shop, and so then like hired these 2 guys from California.
There's California again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To work at the shop because they were like really backed up on
Yeah.
orders and stuff.
Yeah, they need help. Okay.
And so the guys are like the guys are like there, and then the speaker sees them, and they're not wearing clothes.
A little weird. They're naked all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then like the speaker sees them, says some things about that, but then thinks some things.
Yeah.
And so then the dad comes, and the dad's basically like, y'all have to leave.
Well, why does the dad something happens in between there? Why does the dad show up? Other than to kick them out. Bobby shows up too. What does Bobby do? Bobby sees the naked men as well. How does Bobby react when we see these 2 naked men? Is that your hand in the back? Can't tell. No. Yeah, go ahead.
So like not just how he describes it, not just anger, but kind of terror.
An animal wildness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like he's not even thinking; he's just acting.
I like that reading. Okay. What is his action? What does he do?
Violent.
How do you know?
Because he said, like the speaker says, in his eyes and the jaw tight, making ropes into the net.
Yeah.
While along blur, his left hand is raised and gripping an iron file, which he's moving toward the men.
Okay.
Wait.
Does anybody know what an iron file is? Cool. All right. So I grew up with a blue-collar dad, right? Very blue-collar father, very blue-collar family. An iron file can come in all sorts of sizes, but it's generally very large. It's like about the size of my forearm, and it's this huge hunk of metal that's a file, like you would have for your nails or something, but you use it to shave down metal, like sanded. So it's a huge, it's a fucking iron rod, right, that he's running at these guys with. Huh?
Are you sharpen a chainsaw for motions?
You could potentially use it for that. I don't, but
It's round.
it could be. I've never sharpened a chainsaw, so that I don't know about. But you can use it for other things. But anyway, it's a giant hunk of metal that he's running at these guys with to say hello. No. Okay. So Bobby doesn't take it well, is kind of the point. And then the father shows up, and in one of the more understated things you're likely to hear, at least today, the father says, "You boys will have to leave now." And that's how it ends. And they drive off back to California. Okay. Now then, alarm bells for part 3. Anything you guys notice?
Bobby just showing up again, man.
Yeah, and it's his reaction, right?
Yeah.
Like, what do you guys think he's gonna do if he gets to those guys?
Try to kill them.
Yeah, like this. Why do you think? Again, I think like we talked about in part 1, he's offended. Is that fair?
Yeah.
By what now?
By the fact they didn't get together.
Okay, well, maybe so. So you imply something there real quick. But at the very least, it's because of their nakedness, right? At the very least. And to keep adding to our little menu here, the speaker helpfully gives us a word. Does anybody know what exhibitionist means?
Yes.
What is it?
So it's someone who like enjoys being like exposed like out in the public.
Mm-hmm. Which is exactly what these guys, I mean, these two dudes show up, just so we're all clear. This was not a mistake on their part, right? Even though the speaker at one point is like, these guys are going to be embarrassed. He basically says to himself, right? Like, oh no. But these guys show up, they're like, we could get naked in there, it'd be a lot of fun. That's their whole, that's what exhibitionists are into. And I am not one, but what I know of it is, it's like there's a risk involved, and like that's part of it, right? It's this sense of being vulnerable in a public space where you're not supposed to be naked, right? We had a girl last class who was very confused, so I want to make sure we're all clear. Like, just that's what some people are into. And it isn't even necessarily a sexual thing. It's just like something you like to do, like playing Frisbee. Anyway, okay. So I put that on this side. Number 1, because of how Bobby reacts. But number 2, they get kicked out, right, of this very masculine space. I think we could easily say, in the way we've talked about it this semester, the machine shop in these poems seems to be this, like, I keep wanting to say locus, and you guys don't know what that is, but almost like the capital of masculinity, right? Like if masculinity had a capital city in these poems, the machine shop could be that, right? For all kinds of reasons that I don't think we have to get too far into. And these guys are made to leave. They cannot stay there, right? So something about them also gets put on this side. Now, with what you said earlier, Bobby wants to kill them. Why? Do you remember how you phrased it?
Mm-hmm.
Go for it.
I said because they were naked together.
Because they're naked together. Why? Do you have an idea of why you phrase it that way?
I phrase it that way because of all like in the poem, there's like a lot of things like California. Also, like before in like the first stanza, with like the whole line with they're probably homosexual.
Yeah.
The things like with California, well back like in like certain times and even now, California
Yeah.
is known as like a place, like a hot spot
Yeah.
for like LGBT plus activity and stuff.
Yeah.
For people, and then also.
You're good, man. You're good. I mean, that's pretty good to begin with. So, because here's an interesting thing, too. I used to give quizzes when I taught these poems, and then I stopped because it was like, you guys are going to read or you're not. the quizzes never prompted those people that don't read to read, and I just got tired of looking at it. So one interesting thing I noticed, though, when I would give a quiz on this poem is most of, like, well, we'll say half. We'll ballpark it at half. Half the people, when I would ask something like, what's the interesting thing that happens in part 3? That, by the way, is these guys. That's the interesting thing that happens. Apart from, anyway. A lot of people would say something like, oh, the 2 gay guys. And it's like, at no point in the poem do we say that they're involved with each other, right? They could be, but that never comes up, right? That's one of those assumptions again, right? And when you go and look through the poem, it's like, oh, that's not there. So how did that, oh, that came from here. So I'm not saying we're reacting like Bobby. Again, he's his own guy, right? He's kind of down there. But we, as a culture, right, we still have some of this stuff kicking around. 2 dudes get naked together and hang out. They're not immediately disgusted, right? Like, ew, ew, right? That must mean something, right? Like, you can draw a conclusion from that all of a sudden, even though it's nowhere in the poem. So the reason I stress it like that, like, if you had that kicking around, I wanted to dispel that myth, but also I wanted you to know plenty of people make that mistake. It's not just you, okay? But you could easily make the case, I think Bobby draws that conclusion as well, right? And so now, obviously Bobby is exhibiting some violence in response to this. But again, in the way we're kind of building this out, you could easily, and you started to a little bit, like talking about California and whatnot, it seems like all of these things are kind of associated with each other. All of these things are kind of associated with each other. And even witnessing anything on this side, if you're over here, demands a response, right? The father in part 1, we see it here, much more measured than Bobby, okay? You boys will have to leave now, he says. He kicks them out, and he's done with it. In part 1, when he encounters Beauty, he has to leave. So you cannot be present. You cannot be near this side, right? For some reason. And Bobby, again, because he takes things further, takes that further. I cannot be near this side, so I'm going to murder it. Which is interesting. One idea that comes up when you put it that way is that the father and Bobby aren't super different. I mean, they're super different in some key ways. It's not, but they're kind of on the same wavelength. That's weird. All right. Was there anything else in part 3? Oh, there's one thing I want you guys to see. But do you guys notice anything else in part 3?
Well, I noticed, because like I looked it up because I didn't know like who the person was. But the speaker compared the 2 guys.
Marlon Brando?
Yeah.
Okay, it's 2020. He's been dead for a long time.
Yeah, he compared the guys to
Yeah.
him.
Marlon, super famous actor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also compared them to like sort of being like models for like
A drawing class. Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting.
Okay. Any reason why, or you just thought it was odd?
I mean, just because like it sort of goes back to like the whole beauty argument.
Yeah.
Because he was basically being like, they sort of looked beautiful.
Yeah.
In a way.
They're physically beautiful somehow, right?
But at the same time, you have all like the craziness of what's going on in the situation.
Yeah.
Them almost being attacked.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of a nice little interesting contrast. Also, I'm not sure if they could see that the kid was there.
Oh, Bobby?
Like Bobby and the dad. I don't know if they acknowledge him because it's sort of like weird.
I mean, they would know he's there because he's at work, like he's working
I don't
there.
know if they knew that he saw.
They saw it. Oh yeah. Yeah. It doesn't seem that they're concerned with him.
So I don't know if they know. So it's just sort of like maybe that's why he feels like comfortable having these thoughts for once.
Okay. Well, and part of the thing you always have to keep in mind too is all of this is memory, right? So Yeah, a lot of what you're talking about is in past tense, so you could easily make the case that this is him looking back, right? And kind of being able to say it now, whereas back then, maybe not. Because to start off what you're talking about, that section in part 3, he says, I did not know the word exhibitionist, right? And he kind of starts all these things that he can say now, but that also supposes maybe he didn't know to say them then, right? Which is interesting. Why I do that with the mask on. But one other thing I want you guys to notice. We make an interesting kind of association with the exhibitionists in this part, where, like, the reason he says that they're beautiful, that he begins to say that, he says, I recall how fragile and pale their bodies seemed against the iron and steel of the drill presses. And he kind of goes into this reverie. He's sort of thinking about these two guys against this backdrop of all these machines, right? So some other, again, ideas that get associated with them. They're fragile. He's not talking about the exhibitionists, but he's talking about the machine workers around them. He compares them to children. We have this idea of innocence. Again, much like if somebody walked into this room right now and they're completely naked, we would all react, but if only for a split second. Our first reaction would be, what? Like you wouldn't know how to respond, right? Because we have no real experience, right? We have no knowledge of that situation, I would imagine. And so you respond much like a child would just like, what? And again, that gets all sort of lumped together with these guys because it's in that moment. And it gets compared to the machine shop, this iron and steel, right? And any kind of associations we might have with that, with machines, right? Gets kind of put on that other side. Okay. Last but not least. So did anybody do part 4? I'm less clear on that. You did? Sweet. All right. Could you tell us what happens?
So in the beginning, I think they were like wrestling in like the mud or something.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, there's a bit of a, at one point there's a fight. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Part 4 is weird, by the way. So.
yeah, the thing that kind of caught me off guard was hunger for high school glory and pride of their fathers.
Okay. Well, let's start there. All the way, it's pretty close to the top of part 4. First of all, we get a line that's in italics: to gallop terribly against each other's bodies. Anybody know anything about that? Galloping terribly against each other's bodies?
Like what it means?
Yeah. Or where it comes from?
Oh, it comes from the other poem we read.
Good. Very first day of class.
Ferry.
Martin's Ferry begins in autumn begins in Martin's Ferry, Ohio. James Wright poem. It's about people playing football in high school. Yeah. There's 2 lines in an epigraph at the top of this poem. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful. It's from the same poem. It's almost like a plan then. All right. So yeah, so the poem starts that way, and then here at the top of part 4, we bring it back again. So it seems like the speaker wants us thinking about that poem some kind of way, right? Like something, some idea in that poem, the speaker's kind of telling us applies here too, right? Like, you know, the world in that poem, that it's going on here too in some kind of way, he seems to be saying. Okay. And yeah, we highlight that. Then we move kind of into the lives of these boys and as they're growing up. And then we talk about after work with a husband and wife. What happens with a husband and wife?
They're like touching without speaking, and then
They're about to do what husband and wives do.
yeah. And then it says he does not say the word beautiful because he cannot and never has.
And she does not say it because it would embarrass him or any other man she has ever known. That's interesting. We're going to talk about that. Okay. And then after that, we learn what happened to Bobby. What happened to Bobby?
He got shot.
He shot himself in the chest with a shotgun.
I didn't put two and two together.
That's intense. That's all good. And then we end. Where do we end? Do we end in Kansas? It's called a leading question. If I ask you, do we end in Kansas, you could probably easily guess.
Yes.
No. No.
We go back.
We go back to Italy. We come out of the memory. We're back in the present day. Speaker's with his wife again. She's still saying, "What are you thinking?" Right? So we're right back to that first moment. And he's going to tell her about a strange afternoon in Kansas, something he's never spoken of, he says. What strange afternoon in Kansas do you think he's going to tell her about?
That might have all been like the same day. But
I was gonna say the one about Bobby and the
I mean, that's pretty weird.
Kennedy thing.
He's going to tell her about these guys. Of all the days at the machine shop, this is the one that stands out. Bobby's always Bobby, right? JFK was but everybody had JFK. That wasn't the machine shop. These guys showing up and getting naked out of nowhere. He's going to talk to her about that. So he's about to give her sort of parts 2 and 3. So that the poem kind of gets circular there at the end in an interesting way. But okay, that's our summary. Now you pointed out something interesting about beauty. We're going to get there, but I want to highlight one other thing first. The top of part 4, galloping terribly against each other's bodies. A couple lines before that, the speaker says, the men who were once fullbacks or tackles or guards. Does anybody know anything about football other than me? Yeah? Okay, a few folks? Okay. What are tackles and guards? Anybody know? People aren't as up on your football as you think you are. Nobody knows what a tackle is or a guard?
When you tackle something.
That's a verb, but it's also a position. Okay, I can do this. All right. So a tackle and a guard, those are offensive linemen. Does anybody know what an offensive lineman is? Oh, Jesus. Okay. Okay, I can do this real fast. So, you have the ball right here. You've seen football before. You have linemen who are in a line, convenient that. And then you have like a quarterback. You have DBs, linebackers. Okay, none of that really matters. What we're talking about is these guys on the line, right, where the ball is. When that gets snapped, what happens? They hit each other. Tackling would be a penalty, actually, if you don't have the ball. But they hit each other, right, on the line. Offensive linemen, do you wager, what do they do to the defensive linemen?
they attack them.
They block them. They keep them from getting the guy with the ball. Okay? Fullbacks do the same thing. Their really only job is to protect the guy with the ball, block for the guy with the ball, so that that guy can score. Right? Now, why do I stress this point? Well, I'm going to ask this, especially if you're not a fan of football, okay? I think there's like 2 of you in the class, and I hate to call you out, but that's where we are. Can you guys name one football player for me?
Michael Vick.
Michael Vick. Good. Do you know what position he happened to play? It's fine if you don't, but you know Michael Vick, right? Have you guys maybe heard of Tom Brady? Yeah, they play the same position. They both play quarterback. We know the people that get the ball. Those are the highlights. It's rare that you see a highlight of a guy without the ball, right? So we're talking, they're called skill positions, by the way. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver. If you see a highlight of one of these guys in the back of the defense, by the way, it's usually them intercepting a pass, right? Something like that. Those guys get the notoriety. They get the fame, right? But they can't do their job without these guys. Somebody's got to block. One of my favorite cliches in football is, if an offensive lineman is doing his job, you should not know his name. That's like a part of their job description, is to not get mentioned. right? The speaker tells us that that's who these guys were. Even when they were playing, he says, for high school glory and the pride of their fathers, galloping terribly against each other's bodies. They were in a job, even then, where no one would hear or talk about them. So that's interesting. And aren't we kind of supposing that that's the kind of job they have now, right? This blue-collar work that we're talking about, that they're doing, that's what offensive linemen are. That's blue-collar work in football, is linemen, for the most part. So we get this interesting description now, maybe we haven't talked about it in this way, of what blue-collar labor is. Maybe this hard and true thing for these guys, what that actually looks like. It's working hard and getting none of the glory. Right? Okay. We learned something else about these guys. After work, you talked about the husband and wife. They're going to do what husband and wives occasionally do. She touching his chest, his hand brushing her breast, and he does not say the word beautiful because he cannot and never has. And we get that. We've said it a million times up to this point in this poem, right? He can't say it. I get it. And she does not say it because it would embarrass him or any other man she has ever known. Now, why make that point here, do you think? That neither one of them can say it. Why does the speaker point that out to us?
I guess to sort of show that not just like that men can't say it, but like you also can't say it in reference to them.
Yeah. Well, because we know too, because like with the Uncle Ross episode, with Bobby who's crazy, yeah, they can't encounter it, right? They can't be near it. But isn't it also implying, if neither one of them can say it here, that this moment is a beautiful moment? In some way? We haven't really defined what we mean by beauty, but it seems like the speaker is kind of implying to us that these two people sharing an intimate moment is in some way beautiful, right? Okay. Now then. So the man can be there for that. He's a part of that beautiful moment. But what does it mean if he can't say it and she can't either? It's all in deference to this unnamed man. But he's next to beauty, right? He's in it, actually. But what does it mean that neither one of them can say it? We seem to be modifying the rules just a little bit. What can't this man... How can he not interact with beauty, I guess, is ultimately what we're trying to solve right here. He can't say it, she can't say it. Why? He can't acknowledge it, you said. Yeah. Now, why does that matter? Well, again, if you think about the other parts of the poem, maybe the centerpiece is lovely. Well, now looking back, we're kind of saying, well, but you can't acknowledge that. Acknowledge just means recognize, right? That's a super basic thing. To say that you can't say beauty out loud, I mean, that's weird, but like, that's not getting in your thoughts, right? But to say that you can't acknowledge it, that's in here. You can't even recognize how beautiful this moment is with your significant other, right? Can't even entertain that thought, apparently. That goes deep. When we talked about body and soul, and again, I never know if it's this class anymore because you guys are split up and it's weird. But hopefully you're watching the videos. At one point toward the end of that poem, the speaker, he gives reasons for why they don't walk Mickey Mantle. And he says, because it had cost them too much in the eyes of their fathers and everyone else to be a man, he says. And I asked that class, what does he mean? What does it cost them to do that? And they didn't have an answer for me. It's a hard question. I think one thing it costs you in this poem is the ability to acknowledge beauty, right? The permission to acknowledge it. That seems to be a cost. You have to pay that to stay on this side. It seems like it sucks. Because it seems like it also gets lumped in with this, right? You have to live this way. You have to go unmentioned. You can't even see what's beautiful. It just sounds like you live in a machine shop till you die, type of thing. Okay. So why get all that up on the board here at the very small amount of time we have left, I believe? Yeah, we got a couple minutes. Well, there's a couple things you can do. First of all, quick sidebar. We did not at all highlight all the things in this poem, okay? This poem is doing a lot with memory, for instance. It's thinking a lot about bodies, especially in part 4. It keeps talking about bodies, physicality, kind of in the way we talked about old men playing basketball, right? Like there's something to that too. But with what we've pulled, I would hope at this stage you can kind of see how some of these ideas are connected, right? We're starting to build this web of like, there's absolutely a through line in this poem, right? The speaker is definitely thinking about a small handful of ideas just over and over again. And if you were to write about this poem, the way to approach it would be, once you kind of have this information in front of you, the biggest question is always, well, why do we care, right? What does this say about us as a people, a society, a culture? One of the easiest ones is, well, how are we defining masculinity in this poem, you know? What does it look like for these guys? How does it affect them? The easy answer is, because the speaker tells us, well, you can't say beauty. That's in the poem, right? So that's summary. We're not going to do that. But you can go further now because you have these other elements, right? These other associations. You can think about questions, for instance, what is beauty in the poem? Like, how would you define beauty? Does anybody have a definition for us? You just got your hand up.
In the poem, like what it means.
Go for it.
Well, in the part 4 that I read, after they were talking about the fathers and eager to gallop against each other's bodies,
Yeah.
I thought of like maybe they see beauty in like masculine strength.
Maybe. I mean, they definitely see that masculine strength as laudable and something that you should strive for. Absolutely. But I mean, in the way we've talked about it, like, can they even allow themselves to see that as beautiful? I don't think so, right? I think the speaker might. But again, that's an important distinction. Like you learn at the end, the speaker says the word beauty. That's the last word of the poem, intentionally, right? So you get the sense that he couldn't say it then, but he can say it now. Something has changed for him, right? That'd be another question. Why can he say it now versus then? What has changed? But he can look back, too, in different moments, and you get the sense that he's kind of saying, it was beautiful then, I just didn't see it. But that's telling you, too, like all these guys who grew up around that probably stayed over here don't get to see that beauty. So still the question would be, because, I mean, look, most of the time when I ask a student to define beauty, they're like, you know, like pretty. I'm like, well, pretty seems like a flower can be pretty, right?
Do they think of it as like a weakness?
I think they might. Why do you say that?
Just because like they're not allowed to say it, and like I guess maybe the culture they were like around when they grew up, it's like a thing that they look down upon. Like,
Well, sure, but I guess what you're kind of implying too is like admitting something is beautiful admits that you're weak. First of all, seems like it. And again, like the exhibitionists, we are called beautiful, but almost in the same breath, we call them fragile and pale, right? There's this fragility to beauty somehow. So beauty in and of itself might be fragile as well. But then acknowledging that beauty might also mean that you're somehow weak or fragile. Yeah. And we all understand why a guy on this side would not want to sort of admit their own fragility, right? Their own frailty. That's pretty clear. especially for Bobby. Sure. That's the beginning of an argument. Like, I'm not going to write it because it would take too long, but like, I love giving you guys all those statements. One working thesis might be, although we all understand the sort of stereotypical assumption that a man should not be fragile, should be strong, blah, 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 comma. In this poem, that's taken to such that's taken so far that it means men aren't allowed to see the fragility that makes beauty possible. Right? So what you're saying is, if you were to do that, for instance, you're defining beauty in that thesis statement in the poem, but you're also talking about why that one particular aspect means that these men aren't allowed to see it. And I'm not going to give you, there's more that could be said about that, but I'm not going to do that because you'd have to write the paper and think about it. But it's interesting to say that these guys are super tough and whatever, right? All those stupid words that we have. But to also say they're not allowed to do certain things, right? Like that seems counterintuitive to me in a way that you could also think about.